Friday, the first day of the national dialogue is beginning at UNISA in Tshwane. It's supposed to lead to a national convention where everyone will be able to discuss the problems we face. But as you know, there's been a huge amount of criticism for the idea. Several political parties, including the DA and the Freedom Front Plus, and then the legacy foundations have also decided to boycott the dialogue. One of the co-conveners is Roelf Meyer. He has immense experience in these areas. He was also a chief negotiator during the famous Gedesa talks in the 1990s that led to our democracy. Mr. Meyer, good morning to you, sir, and thank you for your time. It's good to talk to you again. You will have seen what I think has been, I'm afraid to say, quite a cynical reaction, I think, to the national dialogue. We've seen some of the foundations pull out. We've seen some of the parties boycott it. Do you believe, despite that, it will still be able to be a success, to be able to achieve something for South Africa?
Thank you, Stephen, for the opportunity. I think it's important that we make a distinction immediately about what the reactions are and the withdrawal that you referred to. The foundations, and there are 5 of them, have announced last week that they are not participating in the National Convention this Friday, but they will go ahead to participate in the dialogue. And I think that is a very clear position that they've taken. They felt that there was not enough time to prepare for the readiness of the convention on Friday. On the other side, President Ramaphosa, who called the date in the first instance, felt that we should go ahead and that the convention should take place on Friday and Saturday so that we can launch the project and get it underway. That means, in my understanding, and I think that is general knowledge, that the foundations will participate in the dialogue as it unfolds. It will run for the next year at least, and it will give South Africans from all communities the opportunity to participate in a dialogue, either at the community level, bottom up in other words, or through structures that have been created over time within certain sectors. More than 20, in fact, I think about 30 sectors have been invited to participate in the convention on Friday and have agreed to come and have representatives there. So it's by no means an indication that the dialogue is not going ahead. It's a question of who will participate in the convention on Friday. As far as the non-participation by some political parties is concerned, I think it's very unfortunate, in my own view, that the second largest party, we must do everything to try and persuade to get them back to the dialogue. They've announced their withdrawal after the fallout that came about earlier this year on the question of certain disagreements with the ANC at that stage. I hope that we can actually make a contribution in getting them back to the dialogue and participating. I'm talking about the Democratic Alliance. And the same would be for other parties in the Government of National Unity. The MK party was announced yesterday that they are definitely not going to participate. That's no surprise. They have never been supportive of a constitutional process in South Africa in terms of their official positions. They basically argue against the existence of the Constitution, despite the fact that they make use of it from time to time when going to court. But that is not a surprise. I think what we're doing basically in the dialogue is to give effect to the constitutional provisions, the Constitution of 30 years ago, and to raise questions about what we need to do to ensure that we fulfill the aspirations and the ambitions spelled out in the Constitution. And that is, to a large extent, what the dialogue is going to be about. So, to correct or complete the fulfillment of those ambitions.
I think one of the reasons that people are so cynical, and I mean, maybe it's just a sort of English-speaking middle-class sense, is that people feel that they've been let down by their leaders over the last 30 years, for whatever reason. It's an intensely political conversation to sort of blame for the situation where we're in. And I don't know if people really believe that this is going to be an independent process, whether it actually is going to be completely independent of President Ramaphosa or even to an extent of the ANC, in fact. I mean, that's one of the claims that's sort of been made against it. So to put it another way, how can we be absolutely certain that this will be a completely independent process?
Yeah, let me say this, President Ramaphosa asked us to participate in this as a group of eminent people, 30 of us, to participate in the process to give those assurances that you are referring to. In other words, to act as the guarantors. None of us are active in politics, and we have, as volunteers, the obligation to try and contribute to make sure that exactly those criteria and or principles that you're referring to be fulfilled in this process. In other words, that it's not a political process, that it's not a repeat of the contestation that you get during election time, but rather an open discussion and debate and dialogue between South Africans coming from all persuasions and representing communities. I think, therefore, it's very important that we ensure that it's a citizen-led process and not a government process, not one that is led by the usual political faces. And so that's one of the reasons why I would keep on arguing all communities to participate, and political people with different political persuasions, because I think we have to come to terms with ourselves and say, what are we going to do as South Africans to correct the things that we are complaining about? And this is the opportunity. The dialogue actually creates that opportunity.
I fully accept that the only way for human beings to understand each other is to communicate. We need to talk. The Cadessa talks are a big part of that, and I can't move away from that at all. We have to talk. I worry, though, about what happens if we won't agree. There are some people, for example, who are not going to change their minds on whether there's a genocide in Gaza, one way or another. You're never going to convince them, whichever way they're in. There's another group of people who are never going to change their minds on what I think is probably, as South Africa, our most important issue, which is the economy. What do we change and what do we don't? So the risk is, one of the risks, it seems to me, is that all this becomes is a shouting match, and only the people with the loudest voices win, and no one changes their mind.
Well, like we've seen in previous dialogues of this nature, we succeeded in the end to persuade each other, coming from different persuasions originally. And we did so on the basis of a tool that we developed in that process, which was called sufficient consensus. I would like to think that maybe we can try the same again. Of course, we will enter, or certain debates and dialogue opportunities will enter with completely divisive positions and or divided positions, and we must accept that. But the question is, how are we going to get out of it in terms of the results that we're going to produce? And I think this is where the idea of a social compact can actually be very important. This is a concept that prevails in other very successful democracies and economic environments in the rest of the world. And if we can find a way to get agreement by means of a social compact between the different sectors of society, that means government, business, civil society, organized labor, etc., if we can find an agreement to actually fulfill those aspirations that are contained in the Constitution and say, how are we going to get fulfillment of that over the next period of time? In other words, get fixed or clear set goals in this compact with an implementation plan that can be monitored as a result of that. I think that can really change. So the chances of 100% agreement, probably not. But the chances of a sufficient agreement between the different sectors to provide for a clear set of goals, I think that is possible. And that is how we've done it in the past, and that is the whole idea of a dialogue. Sit down and talk and make sure we come to a better understanding, at least, of the problem, and then sort out the solutions for that.
So your historical memory of those talks is infinitely better than mine because you were so involved. I was still at school. But at the time, on my memory at least, there were very clearly defined constituencies and sufficient consensus, you may disagree with this, was really if the ANC and the National Party agreed. And that was one of the reasons why the IFP didn't want to take part in the elections in '94, and they were eventually encouraged to come in. What I'm trying to get to is that in our country now, we have so many hundreds of constituencies. I want to believe you, sir. I want to believe that there will be sufficient consensus. I think it might be infinitely more complicated this time.
You're right. There's another reason why it's more complicated, because at that time, 30 years ago, the clear objective was to establish a democracy in South Africa through a constitutional democracy. In other words, the main agreement or the main purpose was to get agreement on the contents of a new constitution for the country. This time it's far more complicated. Just as a starting point, the one thing that South Africans will disagree about is the level of inequality. The second would be the level of poverty. And the third would be the level of joblessness, unemployment. And these are referring to the contestation about the economic answers that we have to provide. So those are the starting points for this debate, inter alia. There are many other things as well. But at least, I think this creates the opportunity and provides us with the opportunity to address it straightforward, very clearly, and come up with possible solutions. Where we find ourselves right now, on this day in August of 2025, is a lot of disagreement, a lot of despondency, a lot of frustration, and quite frankly, a lot of no hope for the future. And if we can replace all of that with a clearer vision of where we're going to, I think that is the determining lesson we can take from the past. At some stage, during those difficult times of the negotiations 30 years ago, we had to ask ourselves, where are we going to in the future, instead of what is it that we... And I think that enabled us to make the leap. If we can do something like that again this time, it can actually bring a major difference from the current situation.
Roelf Meyer, sir, I really appreciate